doing better. Not just saying you were, actually doing better. The quiet kind of better. Not announced, not performed for anyone. The kind where you wake up in the morning and the first thought isn't him. Where you go 3 days and then 4 days without reaching for your phone to check for a message that was never going to come anyway. Where something in your chest that had been tight for months starts, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. Maybe you'd hit 6 weeks of no contact. Maybe you'd started therapy and something was finally shifting. Maybe you'd just started sleeping through the night again, which sounds small until you remember what it felt like not to. Whatever it was that opened up, you could feel it. Something genuine was happening. And then he texted. Or he showed up. Or you got a voicemail from a number you didn't recognize, and you almost deleted it without listening, but you didn't. Or a mutual friend reached out to say he'd been asking about you. The form it took doesn't matter. What matters? What I keep turning over? Is the timing. The way it landed right there, in that exact window. The moment you were finally actually getting better. I've heard this from so many people, and the thing that stays with me isn't he came back. They expected that eventually. What stays with me is what one person said about her experience. She'd been in therapy for 2 months. She said she was actually feeling stronger, and he reached out and told her he could feel something different about her. He said he missed the old her. Those exact words. The old me. She said that phrase destroyed her. I want to talk about why that timing isn't a coincidence. What is actually happening beneath the behavior when a narcissist returns at the exact moment you start to heal. There are 3 layers to this, and I'll be honest with you, the first 2 are things you've probably heard versions of. But the 3rd layer is the one I haven't seen explained clearly, and it's the one that actually changes how you hold the whole experience. One thing before we go further. If this kind of exploration is why you're here, following the actual mechanism instead of just the advice, the subscription matters. It's what tells the algorithm to keep bringing this content to you. And the 3rd layer is the one worth staying for. I don't want you to miss it. Here's the explanation most people have already encountered. Narcissists cycle. They go through periods of what researchers call hoovering, named after the vacuum brand, the idea being that they try to suck you back in. The cycle looks roughly like this. They find a new source of attention, or they deplete an existing one, and at some point the supply runs low, or they get bored, or something in their life destabilizes, and they reach back toward an old source. Toward you. Psychology today describes it plainly. Narcissists usually hoover when they don't have a narcissistic supply or are bored with their current supply. The research on hoovering puts it similarly. It's a behavior designed to re-establish contact after a breakup, triggered by the loss of narcissistic supply. This is real. I'm not dismissing it. But here's the thing. If the cycle were purely internal to him, if it ran on his own timeline, completely disconnected from what's happening in your life, then the timing would be random. Sometimes he'd reach back when you were at your absolute worst, still raw, still processing. Sometimes when you'd moved on entirely, sometimes in the middle. The timing would distribute across all the phases of your recovery. But that's not what people report. Again and again, across different relationships, different years, different people who've never talked to each other, the same pattern surfaces. He comes back in the window where you're actually getting better. Not at your lowest. At the moment of real recovery. That's not supply cycle randomness. Something else is tracking the signal. And I know what some of you are thinking, because I thought it too for a while. Maybe it's just confirmation bias. Maybe he actually comes back at random times and we remember the ones that land during recovery because those are the ones that sting and we forget the ones that don't. Maybe we're constructing the pattern from the data points that hurt. That's a fair thing to consider. And honestly, I can't rule it out entirely for every case. But the specificity of what people describe, not just timing, but him naming it, him saying, "You seem different," him saying, "I miss the old you," That specificity is hard to explain with confirmation bias alone. He's not just cycling. Something in his orientation toward you is responding to something that changed. The first layer is this. The explanation you've already heard is true, but it's incomplete. He's cycling, yes. But the timing isn't random. Something is guiding him back to this specific window, and the second layer explains what that something is. But here's where it gets more complicated than most people expect. I want to bring Carl Jung into this because I think he gives us the most precise framework for what's actually happening. More precise than behavioral models, more useful than the generic framing of narcissistic abuse. Jung wrote extensively about projection, not the casual sense of the word we use now, not just you're projecting your feelings onto him. He meant something structural and specific. He meant that the human psyche, in its attempt to navigate the world, takes aspects of itself that it cannot hold consciously, qualities it can't acknowledge, capacities it can't integrate, and externalizes them, assigns them to the people around it, sees them out there rather than in here. This is something all of us do to varying degrees. We project idealization onto romantic partners. We project our own fears onto people we're in conflict with. We see qualities in others that are partly a reflection of our own interior. But in narcissistic psychology, this mechanism is operating at a completely different level of intensity. Jung described in his later work, in Ion, how the ego that lacks internal coherence, that can't generate a stable sense of self from within, builds that coherence externally, through the responses of other people, through the reflection it receives from the world around it. He wrote, "The unconscious, once it loses its original oneness, cannot be satisfied with substitutes." What that means in practice is this. The narcissist isn't using other people the way emotionally healthy people use relationships, for genuine connection, for mutual support, for the companionship of being known. He's using the people around him to construct the very fabric of his reality. Without that external reflection, the structure becomes unstable. Without the mirror, there's nothing coherent enough to hold itself together from the inside. Jung also described the persona, in 2 essays on analytical psychology, as a compromise between the individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. The persona is the social mask. For most people, the persona is a layer over a real interior self. For the narcissist, the persona is closer to the whole structure, and it needs constant validation from the environment to remain intact. James Hillman, who studied under Jung and spent decades developing what he called archetypal psychology, described this dynamic in terms of what he called the anima projection, the way a man projects his interior life outward onto another person, investing them with a significance that doesn't actually originate in them. When the projection is fully operating, he said, the person receiving it seems almost supernaturally vivid. They seem to understand him without being told. They seem to carry something essential that no one else carries. They feel, in Hillman's words, numinous, charged with a meaning that belongs to the projector, not the carrier. That charge you felt when the relationship was new, that sense of being seen in a way nobody had ever seen you before, that was partly the projection landing on you. He wasn't seeing you, he was seeing himself, and the vividness of that self-recognition felt, from the inside, like recognition of you. The experience of being known and the experience of being projected onto can feel identical from where you're standing. That's what makes these relationships so confusing to leave. That's what makes the return feel like it might mean something real. Now, you become part of that environment. Specifically, if you're an empath, you become one of the best mirrors a narcissistic structure has ever encountered. Here's why. Empaths are attuned. That's the word I keep coming back to. Not just emotionally sensitive in a general way, but specifically calibrated to other people's internal states. You pick up on shifts in mood before they're spoken. You adjust, you accommodate, you attune so naturally that it doesn't even feel like a choice. It's just how you've always moved through the world. For a narcissistic structure that depends on external reflection, this is extraordinary. You don't just reflect him, you reflect him accurately, responsively, almost continuously. You attune to what he needs to see, and you reflect it back. The mirror is very, very good. And then you start to heal. What does healing actually look like from the outside? Think about it in behavioral terms, because that's the level at which he's tracking you. In the first weeks and months of no contact or low contact, you're still highly reactive. Even the effort of maintaining distance involves a lot of internal energy directed at him. He's taking up enormous space in your mind. The mirror is still there, still oriented toward him. It's just not giving him what he wants because you've withdrawn. But the orientation is still his. When real healing begins, when therapy starts working, when you start building something of your own again, when you stop needing to process him every day, something shifts in how you present. Your body language changes. The way you hold yourself in shared contexts, if any exist, is different. The energy you carry is different. If there's any form of indirect contact, mutual friends, social media, anything, what you put out has a different quality. More self-contained. Less available. Less organized around his presence. The mirror has changed. Not disappeared. Changed. What it reflects now isn't him. It reflects you. And the research on hoovering says something precise about this. The timing of the narcissist's return frequently coincides with the period of recovery of the victim, because it is exactly when the signals of emotional distancing become most visible to the narcissist. Not invisible. Visible. The distance becomes visible to him. He doesn't have supernatural awareness. He's not reading your energy field. He's detecting a behavioral shift, a change in the quality and character of what you're emitting. And that shift triggers something like alarm in a psychic structure that depended on your reflection. Now, I want to be honest about something uncomfortable here, because I think it matters. There's empirical research suggesting that narcissists cycle on their own rhythms, returning when their current supply is depleted, regardless of what their former partner is doing. And I think that's also true. I don't think the timing is always about your healing specifically. Sometimes it's coincidence. Sometimes it's his cycle, and you happen to be healing when that cycle comes around. But here's what I do think is true. When the return happens during your healing, it lands harder because his messaging is more specific. He says things like, "You seem different." He says he misses the old you. That specificity tells you he's tracking something. He's not just reaching back toward a former source of supply in a generic way. He's responding to a change he's perceived. And that change is yours. The healing is yours. But the third layer is the one that changes the whole picture. Because understanding the mechanism of projection is one thing. What Jung would say about what the narcissist is actually missing, who he's actually reaching back for, that's the part nobody wants to say out loud. And here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. I want you to think about that phrase again. I miss the old you. It's one of the most common things people report hearing when the narcissist comes back, and I've noticed that it's also one of the phrases that does the most damage, not just because it implies you've changed in a way he doesn't like, but because there's something about the way it lands that makes you feel like you're losing something, like the version of yourself he's describing was more real, more lovable, more worth missing than the one you're becoming. I want to pull that apart, because I think what's inside that phrase is the most important thing in this whole conversation. Jung wrote about what actually happens in relationships where projection is fully operating. He said we don't fall in love with a person. We fall in love with our projection of a person, with the qualities we've assigned to them, the meaning we've constructed around them, the image we've built. The actual person, their full complexity, their contradictions, their independent interior life, often has very little to do with what we're experiencing emotionally. This happens in all relationships to some degree. Most people can recognize it in retrospect. The idealization of the early stages that gradually gives way to seeing the real person. That transition is painful, but it's also the beginning of actual intimacy. In a narcissistic relationship, the projection doesn't give way. It can't, because the narcissist's entire psychic structure is built on it. He didn't just project qualities onto you, he projected the basis of his reality onto you. You became, in Jungian terms, the carrier of his projection, the external container for aspects of himself he couldn't hold internally, his sense of specialness, his sense of being truly seen, his sense of mattering in the world. None of that was you. It felt like you. It looked like intimacy. It felt like being deeply known because the attunement ran in both directions. Or it seemed to. He seemed to see you in ways other people didn't. He seemed to understand something about you. That feeling of being understood, of being truly seen. It was real as an experience. It's not nothing. But what you experienced as being seen was actually the sensation of being a very accurate mirror. When the mirror reflects someone with great precision, the person in the mirror can confuse their reflection for genuine encounter. They can feel seen when they are only seeing themselves. Sam Vaknin, who has narcissistic personality disorder and has spent decades analyzing his own psychology from the inside, put it this way: the narcissist does not love his sources of supply. He needs them. Needs, not loves? And the old you that he says he misses? Wait, think about what that actually means. What was the old you? It was the version of you that had adapted, over weeks, months, years, to serve as his mirror. The version of you that had learned, unconsciously, through 1,000 small adjustments, to reflect him back accurately, to attune to his emotional states, to organize your responses around what he needed to see, to make yourself available in the specific ways that sustained him. That version was you. I don't want to say it wasn't. It was you, shaped by the relationship, molded by the constant gravitational pull of someone who needed to see himself in you. You did the shaping. Those were your adaptations. But they weren't the whole of you. They were the parts of you that had been recruited into his structure. When you start to heal, those adaptations start to dissolve. Not because you're becoming someone worse, because you're becoming someone more whole. You're reclaiming the parts of yourself that weren't organized around him, and as those parts come back online, as you start being more yourself, more self-directed, less continuously attuned to his needs, the mirror changes quality. He doesn't miss you. He misses the function. I know that's hard to sit with. I want to stay with it a moment longer because I think the full weight of it needs to land before you can actually use it. I worked in hospice care for 12 years, and one of the things I observed more than I expected, and that I didn't know how to name until I read Jung, was this pattern around family caregivers when a patient started to improve. There would sometimes be someone in the family who had organized their entire identity around the caregiving role. They were the one who knew all the medications. They were the one who managed all the appointments and made all the calls and held the whole family together in crisis. And that role was real. The function was real. The family genuinely needed it. But then the patient would start to improve. Not die. Actually recover. Get stronger. Need less round-the-clock attention. And I'd watch the caregiver become unstable in ways that were genuinely hard to witness, not consciously malicious. I want to be clear about that. These weren't bad people. But I'd watch them start to emphasize the remaining difficulties. Start to find new things to worry about. Start to create situations that required their intervention. Without any conscious awareness of what they were doing, they were pulling for the dependency to continue, because without the dependency, the role dissolved. And the role had become the self. Take away the function, and there was nothing behind it that had been developed in its place. Here's something I keep thinking about. In those moments in hospice, watching a caregiver reach for a dependency that was becoming unnecessary, I could see the thing that wasn't being spoken. Something underneath the behavior. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even conscious manipulation in most cases. It was something closer to panic, the specific kind of panic that comes when the floor disappears. The narcissist reaching back towards you is that panic arriving in textual form. He may frame it as love. He may frame it as insight. I've been thinking about what I did wrong. I want to be different. He may frame it as noticing something specifically about you. You seem changed. I miss who you were. I don't know what happened to us. These framings feel genuine from the inside because the distress driving them is genuine. The structure is genuinely collapsing. But the distress is about him, not about you. The love he's describing is the alarm response of losing something structural. Knowing that doesn't require you to be cold about it. It just means you're clear about what it actually is. The narcissist who comes back when you start healing is in the same collapse, not because he loves you, because you were the structure. You were the external coherence that held together something that couldn't hold itself from within. And when that structure starts to dissolve, when the mirror starts reflecting something he can't use, something in him can't tolerate the instability. So he reaches back. And a paper published in the Journal of Analytical Psychology in 2025, exploring narcissistic structure through the lens Jung developed in his alchemical writings, described this as a kind of incomplete union that depends entirely on external sources of psychic regulation. When the external source withdraws, the system seeks it compulsively. It's not a choice. It's closer to reflex. Now go back to the moment the text arrived, or the voicemail, or the message through a mutual friend. Go back to that exact moment when you thought, how does he always know? You now know what he knew. He didn't know you were healing. He doesn't have access to your interior life. He never did. What he knew, what he detected consciously or not, is that the signal changed. The reflection was no longer what it had been. The mirror that had sustained him was reflecting something different. Go back to that phrase for a second. I miss the old me. That's what she said. The narcissist had told her he missed the old her, and she said it destroyed her. She heard it as grief. She heard him mourning a version of her that had been real and lovable and worth wanting back. She heard it as evidence that what they'd had was genuine. But you know now what that phrase actually reveals. The old her was the version that was most useful for his psychic structure. The version that hadn't yet begun the work of becoming herself. The version whose identity was still partially organized around his needs, whose mirror was still accurately reflecting what he needed to see. He wasn't saying, I miss the person I loved. He was saying, I miss the mirror that sustained me. The old her was never her at her best. It was her before she understood what she was doing. And him missing it, him reaching back for it, isn't evidence that what they had was real. It's evidence that what he needed from her was never really about her at all. That realization lands differently than grief. It should. He didn't come back for you. He came back for what you used to reflect. Here's what changes when this actually lands. The standard advice for dealing with a narcissist's return is behavioral. Don't respond, maintain no contact, block the number. And that advice is correct. I'm not arguing against it, but it frames the situation as a test of willpower, as though you're resisting something that genuinely pulls at you, as though the message contains real love that you have to be strong enough to refuse. When you understand the mechanism, when you understand that he's reaching back toward a psychic function, not toward you, the frame shifts entirely. The text doesn't carry the same weight. Not because you're stronger, not because you've gotten better at resisting, but because you understand at a deeper level what it is. He's not reaching for you. He's reaching for the mirror. And the mirror has changed. You've changed. The version of you that served that function is dissolving, and something more genuinely yourself is emerging in its place. Jung called that process individuation, the gradual, sometimes painful, always irreversible process of becoming who you actually are. Separate from the roles you've been assigned, separate from the projections placed on you, separate from the adaptations you made to survive in environments that needed something specific from you. Individuation isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming more real, more distinct, more interior, less organized around external validation and more organized around something the Jungian scholar Edward Edinger called the ego-self axis, your own direct relationship with the deepest layer of who you are. When that process begins in you, when therapy starts working, when you start building something that's actually yours, when you start having opinions you don't preemptively soften, when you start taking up space in your own life, the mirror changes quality because you're less available to reflect him. You're using that energy to become yourself. And that's exactly what he can't use. Here's something worth sitting with. The question, how does he always know that framing actually gives him too much? It makes your healing something he can detect and track. It positions him as having some kind of access to your interior life, even when you've withdrawn contact. It makes your recovery partially his to observe. The truth is simpler and more yours than that. He doesn't know you're healing. He knows the signal changed. And the signal changed because you changed. The healing is entirely yours. It's happening inside you, in the work you're doing, in the things you're putting back together. He only has access to the behavioral surface of it, the way you carry yourself, the quality of your distance, the texture of your absence. He never had access to more than the surface. He thought he did because the surface was so responsive, so attuned, so perfectly calibrated to what he needed. But the interior, the real you, the one that's now doing the work of becoming itself, he never reached that. He reached what you reflected. And what you're reflecting now, as you individuate, as you reclaim the parts of yourself that were organized around him, is something he genuinely cannot use. Not because you're defending against him, because you're becoming more yourself. And the self that's emerging, more whole, more boundaried, more grounded in its own interior, doesn't naturally form into the kind of mirror his structure requires. That's not a wound. That's exactly what the work is supposed to do. Marion Woodman, who spent decades exploring the psychology of transformation, described healing from this kind of enmeshment as learning to be opaque. Not cold, not defended, opaque in the sense that you no longer automatically transmit what others need to see. You start having an interior that doesn't automatically become their exterior. You start keeping something for yourself. That opacity is what he's reacting to. That's the signal that changed. Here's something I notice in myself, and I think it might be familiar. After my divorce, when I was in the worst of it, I went into therapy. And one of the things my therapist kept bringing me back to was how much of my mental energy was directed outward, how much of my interior life was actually organized around monitoring someone else, their mood that day, their approval, what they needed from me in this specific moment, whether I was doing or saying the thing that would keep things stable. She asked me once, "What do you actually think about that?" Not, "What do you think they want to hear?" "What do you think?" And I didn't have an answer right away. Not because I was hiding it, because I genuinely hadn't been living inside my own perspective enough to know what it was. That's the shift the narcissist detects when you start healing. Not, "She's better now," which is interior and invisible to him. What he detects is, "She's less organized around me," which shows up in the texture of every response, every interaction, every quality of absence. The way you used to track him is slowing down. The mirror is self-directing. And that's the signal. That's all it ever was. And that signal is entirely yours. It's happening in your interior. He can only ever touch the edges of it. I want to say one more thing, because I think it matters. For a long time, in the relationship, and maybe for a long time after, you probably believed that the version of yourself he needed was your best version. The most loving version. The most present, most attuned, most giving version. The one who always tried harder when things were hard, who stayed up late working on it, who tried to understand him. And some of that was genuinely you at your best, your capacity for attunement, your willingness to try, your ability to hold complexity. Those are real gifts. They're part of who you actually are. But they were being used in a way that didn't serve you. They were recruited into a structure that needed them but couldn't reciprocate them. And part of healing, the part that changes the signal, the part that triggers the return, is reclaiming those gifts for your own life, bringing that attunement back to yourself, letting that capacity for depth apply to your own interior, not just to his. The old you he's reaching for was you, pouring yourself into someone who was using you as structural material. The version of you that's emerging is you, pouring yourself into becoming yourself. Be honest with yourself for a second. When you look at it that way, does the pull of the return feel the same? If it does, that's okay. This takes time to actually absorb. Not just understand intellectually, but feel the shift in weight. But if something has changed, if that phrase, "I miss the old you," lands differently now, that shift is yours. He can't reach it. That's the whole point. I want to be direct about something. The kind of content that follows the actual Jungian mechanism, not just the behavioral advice, but the real structural explanation for why this happens, takes a long time to develop. It's not what surfaces easily. And the reason I keep doing it is because the people who find their way here are the ones for whom the surface explanations were never enough. For whom just don't respond was always missing something. If this reached you, if something in these 3 layers shifted the way you're holding this experience, the super thanks is one way to signal that this kind of depth matters. It's what keeps this channel going deeper instead of wider. You're not just someone watching a video. You're someone doing the actual work of understanding. And that's different. Tell me the timing. Drop it in the comments. What was actually happening in your life the moment he came back? Were you in therapy? Had you started something new? Were you finally feeling like yourself again for the first time in a while? I want to understand the pattern with you. Because when we can name it clearly, when we can look at it from the outside with the right framework, something that felt like it had power over us starts to look like information instead. That's worth naming out loud, together.